Hi, everyone. I am Mariana Mogilevich. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Architectural League of New York's publication Urban Omnibus. One of the things that we do is a lot of close documentation of practices of city making across many disciplines. And so I'm really happy to be moderating what's really our practice panel, which is entitled Solutions, What's Working and What's Not. We heard a lot in the first panel about the current state of affairs for our stock of rent stabilized housing and the really large challenges ahead of us for preserving the units and the buildings. Given where we are with that, it was also really a challenge, I think, for the organizers of the conference to put this panel together with some projects that we can really dig into, folks who are really doing the work in this moment when we have limited models out there. So our panelists for this panel are really the vanguard or test cooks, or we can choose a different metaphor, right, for the people really figuring out how to maintain and restore and create affordable housing in historic structures. And we're going to hear from them about some exemplary projects in public housing, around supportive housing, senior housing that are underway in the city now, and talk about the tools that we have at our disposal, what works, what makes it hard, what could make it easier to preserve affordable housing stock, the buildings, and also their affordability for working people, for people on fixed incomes, people with special needs, and really, as we talked about earlier this morning, the majority of New Yorkers who can't afford the housing that we're in or aren't permanently and safely housed. So we're really lucky to learn from three folks really in the thick of it in policy and design and development. And you have everyone's lengthy bios in your program, so I'll do a very brief introduction in the order in which we'll be hearing from everyone. This panel is a little bit different. Everyone's going to do a brief introductory presentation sharing work and projects, and then we'll get into discussion all together. So we're going to start for this on my right with Jay DiLorenzo, who's president of the Preservation League of New York State. Then we'll hear from Mark Ginsberg, founding partner of Curtis and Ginsberg Architects. And I'll note for this panel, not speaking on behalf of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, but as architect. And finally, we'll hear from Jenna Breines, who's director of real estate development for the West Side Federation for Senior and Supportive Housing, or WSFSSH, which is such a wonderful acronym. So I think we can get right into it with Jay's presentation and go from there.
All right. Tax credit policy on Saturday morning. What could be more exciting, right? So I will try not to put you to sleep. I will try to be brief but concise. And basically my starting role is just to give you a little bit of background on tax credits, not knowing how familiar you are with the historic rehabilitation tax credit programs. We thought just a quick little look at how significant it's been in the nation and in New York State, look at a little bit about the specifics of what these things are, and very generally about what some enhancements are that are being proposed. And then we can delve into that a little bit more significantly later on. A little bit about the Preservation League of New York State. The Preservation League is New York statewide historic preservation not-for-profit organization. And as you can see by the slide, our work is to empower all New Yorkers to use historic preservation to enrich their communities, protect their heritage, and build a sustainable future. And that sustainable piece is really, really important to this conversation, especially when we're talking about the difference between adaptive reuse or rehabilitation and building new. So I hope it's something we can get into a little bit more during the panel. Nothing on this slide is going to surprise you about what we do at the Preservation League. Again, we're based in Albany, work statewide. We make a lot of grants, very early stage grants that jumpstart a lot of historic preservation projects around the state. We advocate for preservation at all levels of government, whether it's local government, a lot of time at the state legislature, one of the reasons why we're in Albany, and also including in DC, with Congress where there's some changes that we can talk about as well. We provide technical assistance. If you're wondering what it means to be on the National Register, if you want to know how to create a historic district, if you want to know how to build a local group, we can help with that. We collaborate with our local colleagues around the state. New York State is particularly blessed with local and regional preservation groups. You have a number of them in New York City who I hope that you all support generously. They are the frontline people when it comes to our neighborhoods, and it's very important that we all support them. But there's others in Rochester, in Buffalo, in Albany, throughout the state that do this same kind of work. So we bring them all together. In fact, we're doing it on Monday, and talk about issues just like this. We award excellence, we draw attention to at-risk sites, and we hope we offer engaging virtual programs. I'm going to just talk briefly about tax credits. In New York State, qualified rehabilitation projects that impact historic resources listed on the National Register of Historic Places can access two historic tax credit programs for rehabilitation, the federal program and the New York State program. So I'm going to talk about each of them briefly. Investments made possible with these credits have been transformational for communities around the state. You look at communities like Buffalo, where they had vacant and underutilized buildings for decades. When I went to school there, sections of the city were a ghost town. We enacted the state, we meaning the collective we, enacted the state historic rehab tax credit. That made the difference between tipping these buildings from vacant and neglected to reinvested and reused. It's had a tremendous impact throughout the state. They have led, among other things, not just to rehabilitated buildings, but also to the creation and rehabilitation of hundreds of thousands of units of housing throughout the country. Let's look briefly at some impact numbers for the federal rehab tax credit. Remember, there's two programs that we're talking about. Between 1997 and 2022, let's granted a long frame, $132 billion in private investment have been leveraged using these tax credits. These tax credits have made the difference between investing these dollars and not investing these dollars. Over 300,000 housing units have been rehabilitated. 350,000 new units have been created in reused buildings, and 200,000 of those have been classified low and moderate income apartments. And this information comes from the annual economic report that Rutgers does every year on these tax credits. Looking a little bit at state historic rehab tax credits, we're working with different time frames, but you can still see the difference that they've made. 16.4 billion in project expenses leveraged between 2009 and 2023. 2.1 billion in completed projects in 2023 alone. So that's, you know, quite a significant level of rehabilitation in New York State. Over 29,000 units of housing created between 2010 and 2023, and 15,400 of those have been classified as low or moderate units. So New York State in particular has been and I'm going to go with my paper. New York State has been a tremendous user, the highest user of rehabilitation tax credits in the entire country. And so this program has made great difference in many places, but New York State in particular. So let's talk a little bit about just four projects. I'm sorry, walking back and forth. Four projects that I think highlight this. And we're going to start in the upper left-hand corner in Rochester. This is St. Bernard's Park. This was originally constructed as a seminary, but it's been converted into a mixed-use senior complex, rehabilitated for $28 million using historic and low-income housing tax credits. Often we see the pairing of historic rehab tax credits with low-income housing tax credits in these projects. And the state tax credit in particular, as well as the federal, have great flexibility. So they were able to utilize rooftop solar on this, expecting annual utility savings of more than $10,000 annually. So it has that flexibility built in. Lower left-hand corner is a project in Newburgh. This is Rupco's $37 million scattered site development. There was little pieces of property all over Newburgh. It includes 24 building sites across a 7-block radius. This is New York's second largest historic district. So don't tell me that this type of development cannot be done in historic districts. It includes the restoration of 10 historic buildings and also added new construction on 12 vacant lots, so new infill. And it also reused what you see in this lower picture, the United Methodist Church, which has become a commercial and community service hub. In New York City in particular, the New York City Housing Authority has worked with New York State SHPO to rehabilitate thousands of apartments in historic buildings throughout the 5 boroughs using historic rehab tax credits. This is a project in the Bronx. This is Middletown Plaza, where the Housing Authority invested millions of dollars with the help of tax credits. I think it was something like 200 units of affordable senior housing. And then in Albany, the lower right-hand corner, the Albany Housing Authority's Steamboat Square project utilized historic and low-income housing tax credits, again, created affordable workforce housing for individuals and small families, with 14 units set aside for individuals with serious mental illness. So these projects have worked. They've worked across the state. And part of it is the way that they are constructed. So let me just talk again in 2 slides. First about the federal program. If you want to use the federal rehabilitation tax credit program, and again, what I'm looking at here are both the income producing tax credits for both of these programs. So owners of income producing real properties listed or eligible on the National Register of Historic Places may be eligible for a 20% federal income tax credit for the substantial rehabilitation of historic properties, and we can talk about what substantial means a little later. That the final dollar amount is obviously based on the number of qualified, the qualified cost of the rehabilitation. But in effect, 20% of the rehab costs will be borne by the federal government. Now, things have changed recently, not so recently, a few years ago, a series of changes, legislative changes and other changes really started to erode the value of this credit over time. One of the critical things that it did was it didn't allow the tax credit to be taken in a single year. The entity that was taking the credit had to spread it out over 5 years, and that really helped to kind of reduce the value of the credit. And if you reduce the value of the credit to an investor who usually acquires that credit, the amount that they turn around and invest in that process in equity goes down. So our goal is really to do things that increase the values of these credits, make them more competitive, increase the market share of people out there who want them, who need them, who can use them. That creates competition, that drives the cost up. That means they're paying more for these credits and more money is going in to these projects. Because in general, if the state of New York gives $1 worth of tax credit, they're not generally getting $1 back into these projects. They're getting something like 80 cents or 82 cents. So we want to lower that margin. So we talked about the taking it over 5 years, rising interest rates, obviously substantial increase in the cost of materials. All of these things have translated into greater financing gaps for these projects that are using these rehab tax credits, and thus reduce the use of the credit and slowed the rehabilitation projects. And when you make that gap bigger, especially in New York State, if you're doing housing, what ends up happening is then the developer who's ever doing the project has to turn around and go to New York State and get a grant to help make up the difference. So New York State's ending up getting it on both ends. So we want to try to find ways where we don't have to spend as much money. Those grant dollars can go to other projects and we can be getting more value for our tax credit dollars. So ultimately, and like I said, we'll speak about this a little more, increase the value of the credit to investors, make it easier to pair with low-income tax credits, and make it easier to use by not-for-profits who do a lot of this work and own a lot of real estate in our communities. That's the federal program, a little similar for the New York State program, but we can talk about that too. The state credit's interesting because if you receive the federal credit, if you get through what you need to do for the federal credit, you're automatically eligible for the New York State rehab tax credit. And we're talking income producing here, as long as you're in a qualified census tract, which is at or below 100% of the state median family income. And that has really limited the number of buildings that are available and the number of communities that can benefit from using the state tax credits for housing. So again, just a little bit, you have to be in a qualifying census tract. It's also a 20% of qualified rehabilitation expenses, but we also have it kicked up to 30% if your project expenses are less than or equal to $2.5 million. So that was a change we were able to get in a few years ago, where we saw that these credits were kind of expensive for smaller building owners to administer. So if we could find a way to kind of increase the value of the credit directly, going from 20% to 30%, then that would make it more likely that someone who's only dealing with $2.5 million or less project could use it. Again, the changes that we're looking at here are to increase the value to the investors, and also what we can talk about, remove the census tract qualification if you are constructing affordable housing. So now communities that aren't in that qualified census tract, that aren't on what's considered a challenged census tract, might now, if these changes go through, be able to utilize the state credit if they are building housing. So we really saw it as a really beneficial way to leverage the tax credit. And obviously, as I said earlier, more money for projects. But just one thing to remember, the great thing about tax credits, great if you're the investor or I suppose the state, maybe not so great if you're the developer, is that you need to do the work before you're eligible for the credit. So unlike a grant, where we can kind of make grants on faith, we can lay out money on faith, we can hope the projects go through, we can hope that they say what they're going to do. With a tax credit, the project has to be pre-approved, done and reviewed, and then you are eligible for those tax credits. So there's a lot of controls and makes them more beneficial, we think. So that's my nutshell speech, and I'm sorry for my technical difficulties. And there you go.
See, okay, this worked. So first of all, I'm not talking about rent stabilization. Most of our projects have city, state, federal funding and have long-term or permanent regulatory agreements, but are not directly rent stabilization. And I'm an architect, not a financial person. So although I'll be talking a little bit, there needs to be a balance between housing and preservation. As I think everyone knows, we have a tremendous housing need in general, particularly affordable. And just to give you an idea, we have projects with clients where the city says we can't fund it for 4 years. There are lots and lots of projects sitting out there that are not moving ahead as quickly as one would like because the city doesn't have enough money. And I'm afraid that is likely only to get worse with what's happening in Washington. The other thing is, unlike market rate housing, where people see a value in living in a historic building or a historic district, it may raise the value of the building, it may raise the taxes. In affordable housing, that doesn't help us at all. Just to give you an idea, we've done new construction buildings, 100 units, and there are 50 to 100,000 applications for those 100 units. There is such demand and such need, and we're not meeting it. Even though, just as another statistic, New York City has been typically producing more affordable housing than the state of California, which is, 5 times the size. So we're trying, we're doing a lot, and it's not enough. So I'm just going to go through, a few projects. So PS 90 was a public school that was abandoned in the 70s. We started working on it in around 2005. it was in bad shape. We had to replace most of the floor slabs and do a lot of work. We created 75 condo units, of which 20 were affordable. The basic deal of how it was funded was the city gave it to the developer for $1, and then the market rate units subsidized the affordable units. We also, and you can see down in the lower left, built a rehearsal and performance space for the National Dance Institute. There was nothing basically left inside besides some lead and asbestos. And so there were no historic tax credits. It's what, 149th Street, Northern Harlem. Hopper Home was actually our first project. At the time we did it, it wasn't landmarked. But we did win a preservation award from the state for this project. And it's the oldest halfway house for women in America. And it still is a halfway house 30 plus years later. Linden Penn Wortman are two developments next to each other, NYCHA, that are in the PACT RAD program. And I talk about Linden are the two images on the left. Public housing has a basic problem that for 45 years, the federal government who built it and was paying for it has not been giving enough money, so there's deferred maintenance. And when you start with deferred maintenance after 45 years, you've got buildings in really bad shape. So at Linden Houses, which is the sort of typical red brick box, and one can talk about it, the brick was so bad it had to be removed. We overclad the building, which made it, changed the image, made it much more energy efficient, and also reduced the local law 11 facade inspection reports significantly. The three images on the right are of Penn Wortman, which was designed by Morris Lapidus, who is a very significant architect. For the time, were very interesting buildings. They were not red brick boxes. The image in the middle on the bottom is of the community center, which we restored, but there was a lot there. It got tax credits. There were a lot of things, and we may talk about more, what you can't do with tax credits. And I think you have to figure out what are the appropriate projects. But in this case, this was definitely something I'm glad we were able to preserve for many reasons. Our William Street project in Newburgh, I think Newburgh's a big topic this morning. We had a vacant lot and two historic buildings. The historic buildings are on the side of the new building. And this is a theme. We had three different regulatory bodies in the local government we had to go through. The historic building, historic commission. We were getting a number of zoning variances, so we had to go to the appeals board, and we had a site plan. We also applied, and there were a number of complications with this for the historic tax credits for the two existing buildings. The new building will be a passive house building. We had the different commissions reviewing us had different comments. The other fact is to make this, we haven't gotten them yet, but are applying for state low-income housing tax credits. And to do that, we needed a certain number of units to make it potentially pencil out and work, which required that the new building maybe be taller than some people wanted. I would also, we may talk more about this, the historic tax credits allow you to only add 3 inches on an interior. I can't do stuff on the exterior. On the interior, if I've got plaster right up against the brick, that 3 inches won't get me to meet the energy code, no less go beyond it, which is what we tried to do. And that takes me to the last point I want to make. The estimate is 80% of the buildings existing in New York City in 2020 will exist in 2050 when we want to be basically, we'll call it a net zero city. To do this, we're going to need, the new buildings are easy. We've done a lot of them. Existing buildings are much harder, and I can go into why, but we have to balance preservation with sustainability. About 20% of the city could be underwater in 2050, 2060, including a lot of historic buildings. So if we don't take this into account, if we don't electrify, because our grid is supposed to be clean by 2040, and by 2030, it's going to be 60 to 70% clean. And when you electrify, if you don't make the envelope more energy efficient, you're going to end up spending more money because gas and oil is cheaper than electricity, even though we want to encourage people to do that. So with that, I'll finish and let Jenna talk and discuss more after.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jenna Breines, and I'm the Real Estate Development Director at WSFSH, West Side Federation for Senior Housing. And I'm here to talk to you about our project, 3 Arts Club, which is this building right here. This is a historic photo. And the building looks pretty similarly today. But first, I'll just tell you briefly a little bit about WSFSH. So we are an almost 50-year-old not-for-profit that develops affordable housing for seniors and seniors who need on-site supportive services because they are being referred from the Department of Homeless Services and have issues related to substance abuse and mental health issues. So we do all the things. So my team specifically develops the affordable housing, but we also staff all of our buildings. So everyone in a WSFSH building is a WSFSH employee pretty much. So we staff the supers and the porters and the front desk staff who are a part of our care team, and also all of the social workers who are on site in the building. So we have a little more than 30 buildings, about 30 projects altogether, and about 2,500 units. And 3 Arts is has been in the works for a long time, but we're hoping to start construction in a month or 2. So I think the reason this building is an interesting one to talk about is because it brings together a lot of the issues that have been raised earlier today, both by my fellow panelists and by the folks who were speaking in the earlier panel. So first, a little bit about this building. It was built in the 1920s. And the 3 Arts Club was actually a club. It was an institution that was created and became, I think, an international institution to support women under 30 who were unmarried, who wanted to move to a city to pursue the 3 arts, which are drama, music, and the fine arts. So essentially, the project provided sort of a monitored dormitory-like setting, safe and comfortable, and also affordable housing that was conceived as a space that needed to be affordable for young women as well.
Excuse me, where?
Oops. Oh, yes, right, sorry. It is located on West 85th Street, 340 West 85th Street, between West End and Riverside Drive. So our revisioning of this building is that it is an adaptive reuse of this historic building, which was originally created with 150-ish dormitory rooms, but now, because of changes that the previous owners made to the building, has about 124. It's very small dormitory-like rooms. But we are transforming the building into an energy-efficient, affordable, accessible building for very low-income seniors, and we'll have supportive services on site. The building will be the units will be rent stabilized when we finish, and so we're transforming the 124 very small rooms into 61 efficiency studio apartments, plus a supers unit, so a total of 62 apartments altogether. And we are working really hard to merge these two separate funding sources, the historic tax credit program and the state's sustainability program through NYSERDA together, which has been very challenging, as Mark just alluded to. So the historic tax credit program for us is allowing us to mitigate or limit our use of other scarce affordable housing funds in New York City, which is great. So we're actually not using low-income housing tax credits at the site, which is a very competitive source. So really the use of historic tax credits here means that another much needed affordable housing project in New York City is able to move forward using those low-income housing tax credits that we are not using. And the historic tax credits and the funding that we're getting from NYSERDA, the New York State Division of Energy, I always forget the.
Energy Research Development Authority?
Thank you, Energy and Research Development Funding, is allowing us to do these renovations, but also make significant sustainability improvements to the building. So we are electrifying the building, we're installing a new roof system, we're going to be replacing these windows with high performance windows. But then also as a part of the general requirements of New York City and specific requirements at the housing department, we're also making significant accessibility improvements, which is also a challenging thing to layer on top of the historic requirements. So I have some photos here. So this is actually a historic photo of some of the original young ladies in the building in the library, which if you come to visit the building, and once we're done, we will definitely be doing a lot of tours. The library looks very similar, except we don't have the drapes. I don't know what happened to them. And we don't have that painting on the wall, and the bookshelves are currently empty, but we will be refurbishing it so it will look pretty much the same, and it'll be used by future residents as a computer room / lounge library. And so this is an original floor plan here, just to talk you through some of the changes that we have to make to the building to make it accessible. And that, which is a challenging thing to do in a historic building. So we have stairs leading up from the street into a vestibule, and then stairs in the vestibule leading up into the hallway. We need to put in a ramp. So we are putting in a ramp. We also have bathrooms that are inaccessible. And so this is we also have a historic sort of miniature ballroom in the building, which we are also refurbishing. So this is an image of our floor plan with the modifications that we're doing. So you can see it's flipped over now. So that the red oval on the far side is the street entrance, and you can see we now have a ramp there. We are modifying the bathrooms downstairs to make them accessible, and we're adding a second elevator, which is a significant change to a historic building like this. But for senior buildings in particular, having 2 elevators is really critical. And you can see the circle on the top right shows the changes that were made by the previous owner to wall off the back portion of the ballroom and create office space under and above where there was a balcony. We're going to be restoring that to its original function. So those 2 separate rooms will be eliminated. It'll be one space again. So here's a picture of the young ladies enjoying a performance in the space. So on the second floor of our building, historically, you can see now the very small dormitory rooms. With this floor is sort of a half floor because of the double height ballroom. So there was 1 shared bathroom, 8 small sleeping rooms, and a space for Miss Poole, who we believe was one of the matrons who lived on site, who assisted the young women, and a trunk room, because of course they all had trunks, and a seating room where they would visit with guests, because I think that men were probably not allowed to come into their rooms. So we are taking this second floor space and turning it into social service offices that will serve our residents, and then also 4 efficiency apartments, which will each have kitchens and fully accessible bathrooms. And here again, this floor is has a few. It's a 2-level floor with a few 3 or 4 stairs, which we have to manage by. We're actually going to install a small lift. In this case, we looked at the ramp option, and that just really didn't work. So here is an image of one of the young ladies in her dormitory room, and we actually still have these little shelf units on the wall, which is great. But you can see there the radiator right under the window, which we are eliminating. Some of these were already eliminated before, but we're transforming the building from a gas-powered building to fully electric for hot water, heating, and cooling, which is a challenging endeavor to make it fit in this space. So this is an example of a typical floor plan with 25 small dormitory rooms, 2 shared bathroom spaces. Of course, you have the trunk rooms. And our updated floor plan for this space will include 10 accessible apartments, each with full kitchens, fully accessible bathrooms, trash room, an amenity space, and we also have laundry actually on the laundry room on the floor, and the 2 elevators. And this is an image, actually, if I go back to the first slide, you can see, here, in the very top of the building, there's a sort of penthouse space, which is currently actually our supers apartment. It's the nicest supers apartment in the city. This was originally an arts, like a sort of an art loft that was used by the residents. So we will be restoring this to its original use as well. And let me get back to this historic photo of the ladies in the loft space. So we will be turning this back into an atelier. We'll provide activities for our residents in this space. And we will also provide access to the roof. I'm anticipating that the new residents of the building will probably maybe not be dressed quite so formally when they're relaxing on the roof, but we will be providing roof access to residents. But the new residents will be lounging on top of a new roof system, which is insulated. And there will also, the space they have to lounge in may be a little bit smaller because this roof space will have to be shared by electric heating systems. We're using a VRF system for part of the building, and also some solar panels because we also have to meet the city's solar requirements. So yeah, so I think this building is a great example of a lot of the challenges that we have to balance when we want to maintain a historic structure, but also adapt it for a new use. And so layering on top, the historic requirements, both from the state and the federal government, but also city landmarks, and then the city and the state's sustainability requirements, and making use of these programs, which brings in more requirements, and then also accessibility requirements, is very challenging. I think we have, with the help of some of Mark's colleagues at his office, we found some great paths forward, but needless to say, it involves a very strong team and a lot of patience, and it is a challenging process. And I think that's about it.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. I think the key word for this panel is really complexity, regulatory complexity when it comes to the financial architecture for these projects. And then as everyone's spoken to as well, in terms of some of the values, right, between preserving historic structures, thinking about sustainability and the future. So sort of moving right in, maybe we can all tackle all three of those and start perhaps with the sort of regulatory questions that have come up, I think maybe especially directly in the Three Arts Club, Jenna, but what kind of challenges have arisen and how you're sort of dealing with the very different, rules, regimes, values between federal, state, and city requirements in some of these projects, and how do you negotiate there, specifically sort of questions of interior, exterior preservation, accessibility questions, building code, what has sort of worked and where some of the difficulties have been?
So I think one of the things that has really struck me as someone who has been in the affordable housing development world for a very long time, and I previously worked at the city housing department, and while there are always challenges in making all of the different city agencies' requirements work together, between HPD's requirements, Department of Building requirements, DEP's requirements, what really struck me on this project was how sort of far outside of that the historic preservation requirements seem to be. It didn't seem like there had been anywhere near as much efforts made at trying to get the city agencies to work together with to sort of understand what's required when you're trying to do a historic preservation of a building. I mean, obviously, the city has done a number of these, but there are sort of, pathways that have been created to help HPD and DOB to work together, and some of the other city agencies as well. But, HPD is not very knowledgeable about the historic preservation requirements. I can say that in my time there, which was lengthy, I never had a historic project come before me. So I think that's one of the things that I've really noticed, is that because, the historic requirements are really coming from the federal government and the state, and landmarks, is sort of separate. There isn't the same sort of forced cohesion and coordination between the city agencies. And so that's really been a challenge, like attempting to make DOB understand what we're trying to do. We actually don't have Department of Buildings approval yet, because the reviewer that we're working with just seems perplexed by our project.
So I'd first say almost every regulation I know of was done for a reason, typically a good reason. The cumulative effect can be problematic. One example, we worked on a building that was done in the 60s, and it had a 20-page drawing set, and we're doing a 100-page drawing set, and having to document accessibility. I mean, sustainability, you used to just sign something, my building complies with the energy code. I actually looked at the energy code. Most architects they found didn't. So there are now about 8 pages of energy code sheets. Same with accessibility. All of these are done for a good reason. I want 2 other points. With rare exceptions, landmarks is only dealing with the exterior of the building. You're going for historic tax credits, you're dealing with both the exterior and interior. And the rules are somewhat different. And understandably, also historic tax credits based on national parks have different standards than landmarks, which is what is appropriate. So that's one whole point. Another thing is I sort of mentioned, but is a real problem with energy, and I've been saying this for a number of years, that there needs to be a little flexibility. If I have a building where the plaster is right on the brick and there is no insulation, and I want to insulate it, and I want to at least meet the energy code, if not exceed it, I need more than 3 inches, which is what the national parks will say. You also get into some very interesting issues. The Newburgh project, originally they combined the 3 tax lots. We had to uncombine them because otherwise, and this was something we talked with SHPO about, national parks would review the new building as well as the 2 historic buildings, and their standards were different. So you get into these regulatory things, and we need to find ways to simplify it without losing the intent.
Yeah, well, not being a developer, I guess I have maybe three things to say about that. One is, I don't think I could ever be a developer because I don't think I would want to do all that. But I think we all come from the same place, which is starting with the bedrock belief that reusing our existing buildings is essential to the health of our communities, essential to our sustainability goals, and really make the kind of places that we all want to live in. So we're willing to take those hard steps, and people people like I have here are willing to go through these difficult processes because they know that the end product is going to be far better for the community than new construction in many cases. And again, I can't say enough about the climate impacts of reusing existing buildings. You know, as the state plows forward on development projects and other things, it seems sometimes that they're talking on one hand about the importance of climate and sustainability, and on the other hand, creating situations where we're incentivizing demolition and loss. So I think there's some bringing together that needs to happen between groups and organizations and advocates on this. The second thing I would say is that that's why it's so important for advocates to continually and incrementally improve the value and usability and flexibility of these tax credits, because we need to, this is hard work, this is costly work, and if we feel like point number one, that this is important work, then we need to make sure that these incentives live up to the importance that we're putting on these projects. And this has been an incremental process over the years. We've never had a state credit that's as robust as it is now, and that's taken a number of actions legislatively and on the state level in order to make that happen. And that brings me to my third point. The state of New York, the State Historic Preservation Office, which is who you go to originally if you're going to do one of these projects, has been historically very flexible, very willing to work with developers, building owners, property owners to do this work. I think where we're going to see more difficulty and have seen more difficulty is at the national level, particularly now if we start cutting staff, if we start cutting programs, particularly at the National Park Service, which is responsible for the administration of these tax credits, we're going to find it more and more difficult to make these changes that we want to make.
Totally agree. I want to add a few things. First of all, New York City has the lowest per capita carbon footprint in the country from all the data I've been able to find. We need to keep the density. Secondly, when I started as an architect in 1985, 87, it cost $100 a square foot to build a new building, affordable housing. It's now costing $500. And then finally, there was discussion in the first panel of why rehabs are getting so expensive. We're typically having to move tenants out because of lead and asbestos. That is very costly. And it is often more expensive to rehab an existing building than to build a new building.
Maybe I'll ask one other question and hopefully leave time for a couple of questions from the audience. So how to phrase this? I mean, a lot of this also comes down to reconciling competing different values, right? And what we're valuing in these projects, thinking about things like cost, preserving integrity of facades, creating a viable, affordable project. I'm also thinking within that about something that came up, Jenna and Jay, in your presentations, which is also the viability of doing work like this, for example, in what's already a kind of high rent, high property value district. So also thinking about the distribution of affordable housing. I guess, with that, I wanted to ask you, Jay, a little bit about some of the changes, enhancements that might be on the horizon with those sorts of questions. And I guess, I think further thoughts on some of the economic questions.
Yeah, I mean, I can bring up probably 2 points, one for the federal credit and one for the state credit. So we don't have anything proposed federally as of yet. We'd expect new legislation shortly called HTC Go, which would bring past enhancements forward that have already been proposed and add some new ones, like making a similar increase in the credit value for projects at or below $2.5 million in qualified rehabilitation expenses. But some of it is a little technical, but could be very impactful and has to do with things like the substantial rehabilitation of a building that you have to do in order to qualify for the federal rehab tax credit. So basically, in order to get the tax credit, the federal rehab tax credit, the commercial tax credit, your project, you need to be putting in and investing at least 100% of the adjusted basis of the building. And that's just a calculation that looks at the property minus the value of the land. But you also have these big office buildings that we've been having a lot of conversations about reusing for residential use, and that can make it really tough. If your project needs to be 100% of the adjusted basis of that building, that could be a lot of money. So one of the things that we're working on at the federal government is to have them propose that your substantial rehabilitation is only 50% of your adjusted basis, which would make it more likely that you could get these projects done. And I would kind of reemphasize on the state level is the separating the federal credit from the state credit. So now you have the person or the entity, the taxpayer that takes that federal credit in a development has to take the state tax credit. And what we want to do is we want to separate them and bifurcate them because some investors just don't have that tax liability to take them both. So we feel that that will increase the value of these credits, more competition, more equity into the projects. But probably more that it pertains to housing is removing that census tract qualification if you're producing affordable housing. And that would, I think, get to your point about spreading this credit around so that it could incentivize the kind of development that we want in these communities, affordable in particular.
Yeah, I think I didn't mention this actually, but we are anxiously waiting for the change that Jay just mentioned at the state level, which will allow the fact that we already have a regulatory agreement from the housing department requiring our building to be affordable, and this will allow us to take advantage of the New York State credit in addition to the federal credit, because at this moment, 2 days before, well, some time before the state budget is passed, we are currently prohibited from accessing the state historic credit because we are this building on 85th Street is located in a census tract, which is too high income, which means that, if this tweak to the New York State historic regs doesn't happen, we're leaving $5 million of equity on the table, and we'll have to fill that with city subsidy. But I think the conversation about what needs to be done to make affordable housing development and more affordable is a very long one, but I think there are some tweaks that could be really helpful, probably to everybody in this room, which would be just to make the information about what is feasible more accessible. We have a historic preservation consultant that we've hired to shepherd our project through this process. And we're working with a team of very experienced architects. But we still had to waste a lot of time trying to figure out what types of solutions to some of the problems that I mentioned have been approved by national parks and also by city landmarks in the past. So we need to put in energy efficient windows. Which energy efficient windows have been approved before? What kinds of insulation solutions have been approved? What kinds of ramps have been approved before? You can find some examples if you look around, but it's challenging to find this information, and it would be really helpful if we could just see all of the examples and not reinvent the wheel and make use of things that have already been approved. I think it would probably make everyone's process a lot simpler.
I just want to give an example of different regulatory issues. The New York City Building Code currently, we're going to get an existing building code, basically says if your value is more than 50% of the value of the building, you need to bring the building fully up to code, meeting accessibility requirements, fire protection requirements, et cetera, which then significantly increases costs. So the tie-in of different regulations can force you to do things that you might not otherwise need to do.
I want to make sure we have some time still for questions from the audience. I think we'll be going around again with a mic.
Hello. I live in a neighborhood that has a lot of supportive senior housing, and it was built because there was a need. Probably the oldest is about 40 years old, but what's happening is that people in the community are not getting into the senior housing. So is there a way that it can be legislated, like maybe 2/3 goes to the local population?
I think one thing that's important to know is that a lot of senior housing is funded by federal sources, and those federal sources have very specific requirements about whether you can geographically limit the marketing or have geographic preferences in the marketing. So like the HUD 202 program and the Section 8 program specifically say that you can't have a preference in a geographic area that's smaller than a county. So it's a federal problem. So you may remember that like some affordable projects in New York City used to have marketing preferences for the community board, but that's never been permitted for senior housing with federal funds because of the HUD regulations.
The city was, the city used to have a 50% preference for local community boards, and they were sued, and now we can't. And so it was tied to fair housing.
Right, but never in the federally funded senior housing. That's always been, it's a challenge.
I think we can take one more question. Two. A question up here and another over here.
I'm glad to hear there's an initiative to remove the census tract requirement for affordable projects in New York State. I wanted to ask about the homeowner preservation tax credit program, which also has a census tract requirement. And this program can be very, very useful to longtime homeowners in places like Brooklyn, where I live, who are struggling to maintain their homes, but unfortunately, through no fault of their own, ended up living in census tracts which now have become much, much more affluent, and those tax credits are completely out of their reach now. A few years ago, we worked with State Senator Myrie, who made some progress and a look back on eligibility for those kinds of homeowners, but it would be much better if we were able to do an income test for those homeowners, like what we're talking about for affordable projects, so they would have access to the tax credits to maintain buildings that, if they don't have ways to maintain their buildings, their alternative is to monetize them, sell them, and leave, which continues the pattern of gentrification that happens in these neighborhoods. Is it possible to go in that direction?
Yes, I think it's on a list of suggestions and thoughts about modifications. I think one of the most important things with the state residential tax credit right now is that it has actually decreased in value since January 1st legislatively, just because the initial legislation called for it to be solely phased out. And so there's legislation now, which is the priority in the state in Albany, to build that tax credit up to the 50,000 per home and per credit, and to make it permanent. So I think that's the first step that we need to take on that credit.
Okay, we've got one hand over here and then.
Hi, I'm Patricia Murphy, and I'm with Preserve Harlem's Legacy and Building Conservation International. And I feel that a lot of these construction people overcharge, and the asbestos removal and everything, I think is ridiculous to what they charge for that. And I think there should be a law against these overpriced services and stuff, because I think asbestos shouldn't be so complicated. I mean, you have the white equipment, you have the hazmat suits on. It shouldn't be so complicated to people to make it sound. And the cost of, construction and stuff like that, I think is really overpriced. And there has to be some way to lower the cost of all these things. There must be some kind of way, And with historic preservation too, that they may make allowances. That I've heard of some cases where they used steel in place of wood. There was a garden in Pennsylvania, a farm there, where the barn was a landmarked building, and it had great big wooden beams inside of it. It had a fire, and they rebuilt it to make it look the way it was before, but they used steel in place of wood, because wood would be too expensive. And I think they should look at those things, look this all around, because these high prices and everything is usually going in people's pockets.
Well, I would just say that steel tariffs and wood tariffs are not going to help us.
Great. Well, I think with that, we're going to bring this panel to a close. Thank you so much to the three of you for the great presentations.